Hello everybody, today I'm going to read an article that I wrote about Syria, and Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher that can maybe help us understand in a different way this conflict. Let's have a look. The war in Syria is currently the bloodiest conflict in the world. There is no other part of the globe where so many victims have been claimed in a period of a few years. The war in Syria, which is already in its 7th year and has been fought in vast portions of the territory, has led to more than 400,000 victims, in addition to more than 12 million refugees. Although the fronts are many, in order to simplify, we can say that two main opposed groups are the forces loyal to Assad on the one hand and the rebel forces that aim at overthrowing the regime. Within the second group there is a great variety of factions, among which we also include the infamous ISIS, which currently is in very bad condition, fortunately. A special mention is needed for the Syrian Democratic Forces, which include Kurdish militias, and which, although officially opposed to the Assad regime, have in fact fought almost exclusively against Turkey and Islamist forces such as ISIS and al-Nusra. From this brief description, one understands why the conflict proves extremely confusing to an external observer. It is difficult to place the various actors of the war in the territory and the different battlefronts. The vagueness of positions and alignments is so accentuated that it is difficult to understand who is friend of with whom and who is the enemy of whom. And yet it seems that in the West one thing is clear and incontestable, namely that Bashar al-Assad is a cruel dictator who does not have any scruples to slaughter indiscriminately his fellow citizens through the use of armed forces and, it is said but not confirmed, through the use of chemical weapons. And for this reason in the West it is considered legitimate that Assad is overturned as soon as possible, or that in any case he leaves the power in order to allow a process of democratization of the country. Accordingly, those who are supporting Assad, such as Russia and Iran, are accused of perpetrating the regime of terror and of prolonging the war. My position is that this interpretation of the Syrian Civil War is to be rejected in its entirety. Some might argue that if Assad is a bloodthirsty tyrant, on the other hand, many of his opponents are even worse. In addition to ISIS, in fact, a particularly active force is the aforementioned al-Nusra, a branch of al-Qaeda, along with other fundamentalist Islamist factions. But those who consider Assad the tyrant to be toppled at all costs adduce the presence of moderate armed forces who demand democracy and freedom on paper, such as the Free Syrian Army, although it is possible to find sources that express heavy doubts even on these so-called moderate forces. However, in order to justify my position, namely that the West is wrong to cheer for the rebels, and that we should instead hope that Assad will soon restore the legitimate power in the country and put an end to the war, I will refer to Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher of the 17th century. The text for which he is remembered is the famous Leviathan, written in the distant 1651 and considered one of the fundamental texts of modern political science. One of the main theses of the book is that citizens' obedience to the legitimate power of the state is a virtue that preserves peace and prosperity. And what if legitimate power is unjust, arbitrary, cruel, dictatorial and oppressive? Also in this case, obedience is a must. In truth, Hobbes considers the possibility of rebellion only when the lives of citizens are threatened. To justify the blind and patient obedience of the citizens, Hobbes posed a very simple argument. Power, any power, even despotic and unjust, still manages to guarantee peace and order. Without it, man returns to the state of nature where everything is permitted, and man releases its darkest and most destructive energies. In the state of nature, violence, oppression, war, and chaos reign. Reducing the thought of an author to biographical facts is always quite a slippery operation, but in this case it is useful to remember that Thomas Hobbes experienced with great upheaval the events of the English Civil War of the years 1642-1651. The main character of this traumatic historical passage was Oliver Cromwell, an exponent of the small nobility, a religious fundamentalist of the Puritan cause, considering himself on a mission for God. In a short time, Oliver Cromwell passed from being a courageous leader able to confront and defeat the troops of King Charles I to becoming a despot and a tyrant, able to do what many monarchs before him did not manage to do, to abolish the Parliament. Also to Oliver Cromwell is to be attributed a fact that impressed the contemporaries, the beheading of King Charles I offered in public square. The Civil War had a heavy death toll, about over 200,000 dead. Throughout the kingdom, in Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England, it was bloody chaos. It is therefore possible to infer that from this painful experience, Thomas Hobbes developed an aversion to any form of violent revolution against the established power. Every time that discontent with those in power turns into rebellion with the aim of overthrowing the existing institutional system, the endurance of the state is jeopardized, and therefore also the survival of the citizens themselves. And considering some famous revolutions of the last 300 years, it is really hard to blame Hobbes. I know that I'm going to say something not very mainstream, but in my opinion it is difficult, for example, to argue that the French Revolution was a positive historical passage for the French. Think of the dead among the armies of the opposing sides, of the bloody repression of the region of Vendée, of the guillotine and of the terror of Robespierre, who, as a demagogue on the side of the people, turned out to be a centralizing cruel dictator. And he who would object that French Revolution produced the drafting of human rights is wrong. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789 was a striking case of copy-paste from the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. And what about the American Revolution then, since it has been cited? Was that too an unjust form of organized violence against the existing system? The American Revolution was not a real rebellion to overthrow the established power. It was a war of independence of a colony which was in a position entirely subordinate to the homeland, England. It is a very different thing. Another case of violent revolution that had terrible repercussions and devastated an entire country was the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Russian people were exhausted by an annihilating and meaningless war. Tsar Nicholas II had shown the utmost indifference towards the millions of Russian soldiers sent to die against the Prussian and Austro-Hungarian lines. And so a revolution broke out, which had two phases. The first one, in which a liberal power was imposed, and a second, the famous October Revolution, in which the Bolsheviks, the most radical faction in the field, carried out a coup, ushering a period of civil war against the Tsarist and conservative forces, and promoted a long and bloody repression of those who expressed their opposition to the new power. Very cautious death toll speak of over 10 million deaths, most of them civilians, of course. And as if this were not enough, the result of the Russian Revolution was a dictatorial regime, that of the Soviet Union, known for being one of the most heinous regimes in history, with all due respect to the sympathizers of the communist cause, of course. And let's go back to Syria now. The Syrian revolution developed similarly to the aforementioned revolutions. The scheme is the typical one. A deep discontent leads initially to moderate protests, then to violent protests. Then there is a breakout of real hostilities, and moderate foes are typically overwhelmed by radical and extremist forces, which end up gaining power and imposing a more authoritarian and ruthless regime than the one against which the protests were born. The last phase of the Syrian revolution is missing. Assad, also thanks to the help of Russia and Iran, is in fact winning the civil war and maintaining the legitimate power. The cruelty of the rebel forces, such as ISIS and al-Nusra, has also contributed to this result, for it has made the full support of the anti-Assad forces unjustifiable in the eyes of the Western public opinion. Yet, in the West, the press continues to insist on how cruel Assad is and how the cause of the moderate rebels is right, as if the expulsion of Assad alone was able to bring peace and democracy to Syria. Nothing could be further from reality. Assad is a tyrant, a cruel dictator. Nobody denies it. But 400 deaths, 12 million refugees and the destruction of an entire country were caused by the civil war led by rebel forces, a rebellion that initially aroused the interest and applause of the West. The presence of a dictator does not justify itself the interference of foreign countries. They should never give neither logistic nor military support to the factions opposed to the constituted power, however unjust it may be, for the simple fact that violent revolutions are always harbingers of irreparable damages, just as Hobbes wrote about 400 years ago. There are still many dictatorships and authoritarian regimes in the world. If the international community wants to favor transitions towards more liberal and democratic regimes, the road to follow is another, completely opposite to that of confrontation and of violent revolution. That is, promoting as many commercial and cultural exchanges as possible, and opening the country subject to a dictatorship through development programs and international cooperation. Such an approach would bring prosperity, and along with this also a greater cultural dynamism, a greater circulation of ideas. It would inexorably trigger a debate around respect for human rights and individual liberties, a debate that could pave the way for the only kind of revolution that has really success, the Velvet Revolution. Lately, it has already happened in Gambia. It happened in Armenia. It could happen elsewhere. It could even happen in Syria, although today it is less likely than 7 years ago. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.